A long time ago, the dollars began to flow righteously. Hands so used to being stuck out in servitude joined together in solidarity. What unfolded was one of the major reformations in the US, one which sought to redefine and deepen the ideals of the American Revolution. Unfortunately, like the other major paradigm shifts, the labor movement was stunted and partially eroded. We will discuss one of the elements of that erosion, labor consulting, which is better known by its infamous moniker, union busting. We'll be learning about their strategies in particular. As a leftist, you should consume this for two reasons. First, it's going to help you win union drives. Second, it's going to sharpen your rhetoric. This is to date the most comprehensive attempt at detailing and compiling the strategies of union busters. If you're pro-union, a leftist, or both, I hope you will take steps to implement this knowledge. Let me begin with the source of my information, along with a brief disclaimer about it. My primary source for this video is a book named A Union Buster Confesses by Marty Levitt. It's over 30 years old. Despite its age, the contents have made the chance of irrelevance, frankly, improbable. A union buster would have to be an idiot to trade in the strategies referenced in this book for inferior ones. They are horrifically timeless, adaptable, and solid. Even if I wanted to use another source, I wouldn't be able to. A Union Buster Confesses is really the only long-form detailed source I could find on the subject of union busting. Marty, the author, is of questionable integrity. He was charged and found guilty of multiple financial crimes, and there are parts of this book which are exaggerated. But something that is worth noting is that the book has been continually disparaged by labor consultants as frivolous in its charges. If it mattered, I would personally find the book even more compelling, since the labor consultants are trying to get me to put it down. What we are concerned about are the strategies that Marty referenced and the history of the trade, as well as the advantages that they hold over labor. Now, Marty does a bad job in compiling and organizing the strategies that he and his brethren used. They are haphazardly strewn and vaguely described throughout the book. I, however, took hours upon hours to distill and compile these strategies for you to consume and use against the union busters and their allies. So without further ado, let's get into the content. It would be prudent to open up with the brief history of both unionization and union busting before we discuss the nature of the two. The history of unionization is relevant because it informs the principles and strategies that both the busters and pro-labor advocates use. Before the NLRA was passed in 1935, organization was much more of a fuck around and find out kind of endeavor. Strikes up until that point were informal, and the protections for anti-commercial behavior were non-existent, save for the 1926 Railway Labor Act, a bill that is much less generous in its protections of civil rights. As a result, the earliest form of union busting, strike breaking, was often incredibly dangerous, oppressive, and even lethal. The modern conception of strike breaking and labor sentiment as a whole can be found in events like the Ludlow Massacre, which was the climax of the Colorado Coalfield War. You probably heard about it in history class. On April 20th, 1914, Colorado Fuel and Iron Company orchestrated an attack on a 1,200-person temporary settlement, inhabited by the strikers and their families. They had formed to issue demands in regards to their pay and working conditions, specifically the compensation for miscellaneous activity like rail splitting, fair compensation for product yields, and the installation of 8-hour workdays, so on and so on. Due to the fact that many companies own the living quarters of their workers, they were forced out of their rented homes, choosing to hunker down and set up camp, remaining there peacefully until the morning of the 20th. Late that morning, company guards and National Guardsmen stormed the camp and killed 21 men, women, and children. Many more died in the following days. This event was one of the most critical moments in American labor history. It also laid one of the cornerstones of modern union busting. A whirlwind of anti-corporate sentiment was kicked up from the massacre, and the congressional hearing found John D. Rockefeller Jr. responsible for inciting it. Anarchists, leftists, and labor leaders began an organized protest of the Rockefellers, which urged the family to hire W.L. Mackenzie King, a labor relations expert and future Canadian Prime Minister, to rehabilitate their image. Like all things American, the labor movement had to wait 2 decades for a progressive executive branch, supermajority in Congress, and left-leaning Supreme Court to actually pass a proper bill, i.e. the NLRA of 1935. to truly protect workers from encroachments on their right to earn and live. At the time, the Depression had triggered a wave of strikes that, combined with the progressive leaning of the administration, set the stage for the National Labor Relations Act. According to the National Labor Relations Board, the custodial organization of the bill, an encompassing law was needed to protect Americans' right to association, specifically determining that the collective bargaining process was in much need of reforming. While the NLRA was the watershed moment in American labor history, it also served as a recipe for labor's undoing in the future. You see, managers and executives of the corporate world had to trade their old Ludlow tactics for subtler ones, greatly informed by the parameters set by the law. The various capital interests also had the backing of, resource individuals, and governmental figures sympathetic to those individuals. In addition, they had an interesting man on their side, named Nathan Shefferman. It's important to understand how modern union busting was formed because it actually bears its lineage to Shefferman, more so than anyone else. He was actually a part of the original National Labor Relations Board. In what capacity he was involved in the doings of the organization are unknown though. But working inside the original NLRB, the organization that directly informed the construction of the NLRA, probably gave Shefferman some insights into the material weaknesses of the bill. After Shefferman's brief stint in the NLRB, he was hired by Sears to work as their Director of Employee Relations, a position created for the sole purpose of aiding Sears in the quest to thwart organization efforts within the company. This is where Shefferman made his bones, but it wasn't where his journey ended. He eventually broke out on his own and founded Labor Relations Associates of Chicago, or better known as LRAC. Without getting too far into it, the company was the tumor that metastasized into modern union busting. Nearly all 21st century union avoidance law firms, either directly or indirectly, traced their lineage and practices back to LRAC. Shefferman's greatest contribution to union busting wasn't just LRAC, but its strategies. Marty takes great pains to highlight the doublespeak that shrouds nearly all of the strategies that we will later discuss. Nathan Shefferman was the man who popularized its use among labor consultants. Doublespeak, for those who do not know, is a term coined by George Orwell in his famous book 1984. It means to obscure intent, commonly through vague euphemisms, or phrases that reliably protect the user, without forcing them to truly answer. The doublespeak that Shefferman utilized was rooted in three main things: an underlying distrust of workers and belief in the virtue and authority of management, shrouded by diffusing language that feigns to promote egalitarianism, or union values. Shefferman was also the source of the union alternative, employee roundtables. These roundtables were much more like the doublespeak mentioned before, pretending to be something virtuous while disguising something vicious. The employee roundtable would primarily serve as a pacifier for any burgeoning intent to organize by pretending to be a suitable alternative. Not only did it come up incredibly short in that regard, but it actually undermined the organization effort through its secondary purpose, surveillance and control over discourse. There was one true sentiment that Shefferman worked to spread as discreetly but as thoroughly as possible: unions are poison. Now, the counteroffensive wasn't just confined to intercompany schemes. It took to the halls of Congress in the form of amendments and additional bills that curtailed certain union gains. In tandem with the proliferation of labor consulting were two major bills: the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 and Labor Management Reporting and Disclosures Act of 1959. The Taft-Hartley Act can be considered the second part of the NLRA, constraining the actions of unions who some considered to be treated with far too much leniency. There are some good provisions in this act, such as the enforcement of the union's obligation to also bargain in good faith, the prohibition of excessive fees and dues, the exclusion of supervisors from the voting pool, variations in election types, and protections against the coercion or restraint of workers' freedoms by unions. The catch was that the closed shops were also prohibited. Closed shops are essentially unions that a worker must join before beginning their employment. Now, there's a lot of debate on that last provision, but that will be for another video. Finally, the secondary strike, or sympathy strike, was prohibited, which meant that outside unions couldn't strike without a direct grievance targeted against their specific employer. Now, this bill was a give and take kind of situation. However, allegations that certain provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act contradicted each other in principle cropped up. The consensus among these dissenters seemed to find that they didn't mesh out in the union's favor. In the case of the Landrum-Griffin Act, labor consultants especially liked the financial provisions. The bill required a couple of things. for unions to file a copy of their constitution rules, financial reports, and conflict of interest transactions. Labor consultants had a bone thrown to them, and for a small price. The law also required companies to disclose expenses for labor consulting. However, there were a ton of loopholes. Marty and many other busters never filed disclosures due to the fact that disclosure was contingent upon when a consultant interacts directly with the voting unit. As you'll soon see when we go over the strategies, union busters use managers to do their bidding. Even if consultants did interact, the Labor Department really has no reliable way to check the accuracy of the reports. Things weren't all too good for union busters at the time, though. In 1957, Congress held a series of hearings, ordering key LRAC members such as Shefferman and a man named Herb Melnick, who was one of Marty's mentors, as well as top union leaders to testify on suspicious behavior. What they found during their independent investigation and in the subsequent hearing was a laundry list of illegal activity committed by Shefferman and his colleagues. Activities such as conniving with labor officials, manipulating union elections through bribery/coercion, threatening to revoke benefits of pro-union employees, installing management sympathizers into union positions, rewarding employees who worked against the union, and spying on/harassing workers. The fallout from this investigation triggered the shuttering of labor consultants of Chicago and the disbandment of multiple unions. Dozens upon dozens of union avoidance consultants burst out of the defunct company like spider hatchlings out of a swollen egg. Many of them went on to form companies that carried on the union busting torch. Companies such as 3M, not to be confused with 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, became the new spawning ground for eager labor consultants. Now it's worth touching upon what some of you might be wondering. Why am I speaking so harshly about the character of the union busting industry? Let me pivot really quickly to answer that pressing question. Surely, from an ideal perspective, given the liberties of our nation, both sides should be given a fair shot to convince their fellows on how to utilize their rights. That's one of the core tenets of discourse, right? It's extremely difficult to argue against everyone getting a say on important issues, but the reality of things doesn't align with the ideal at all. Unions have been continually pitted against a depraved institution, one that relies more on Machiavellianism to control consensus, as opposed to proper ethics. On the other hand, despite its blunders, unions bear at least some level of loyalty to Western norms and ethical principles. It's also a grassroots institution. Unions aren't the focus, though. The character of union busting and how the institution operates is. We'll touch upon that in a moment. The reason why I carry such a negative perception of union busting is, in short, due to the hypothesis that it, along with the outsourcing of manufacturing, automation, and obsolescence, have led to the resurgence of wealth inequality in America. Wealth inequality is, without a single shred of a doubt, the most important political issue that the United States, and even the vast majority of countries on Earth, face. I touched upon this in my last video, but when resources, especially mediums of exchange such as currency, aren't distributed fairly, people suffer in nearly every aspect of their lives. Unionization in the US is supposed to protect and foster the right to earn. It was and still is the living embodiment of balance. Balance in what one earns and owes accordingly. In other words, unions take the ideal that underpins the right to earn, fairness, and acts as its conduit. On the other hand, it's assailants perpetuate the corruption of these ideals. Outsourcing and automation were the devastating factors in wealth inequality, and that is something that will be expanded upon in a future video, but they were subtler in comparison to union busting. The former was like a silent hurricane that rips everything from the foundation. The latter is more like a Cold War, waged on the parts of the economy that the capital interest couldn't bend to their will. It's easier to start in this direction because union busting is low-hanging fruit, ripe for the taking. Unions reduce unfair inequality among citizens. Union busting in its current form is an unwarranted impediment to its development. Its sins are so obvious and roastable. That all being said, the study of economic effects that union busting has had on the average citizen is scarce. We only have a series of studies that measure the effects of certain labor laws and the measurement of the reduction of union ranks. What we're missing is a serious body of research that studies union busting's contribution to wealth inequality. However, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out. Union busting is estimated to be a $500 million industry. Within the primary source, union leaders allege that busters prevented hundreds of thousands of workers from joining their specific international union alone. We must draw upon what we have, compile what is needed to thwart and reform the hideous profession. To do so, we must seek to understand their principles, strategies, God, even how they wipe their own asses. Let's begin. Labor consulting firms are formed through an alliance between consultants and labor attorneys. Over the past few decades, however, firms such as Labor Relations Institute, Ogletree-Deakin, Jackson Lewis, and Littler Mendelsohn have turned this alliance into a much more legally minded one. Each of these firms have spent an unbelievable amount of time cleaning up their image, specifically through ironing out the consequences of their strategies, ensuring that they are protected by inadequately constructed law, and masterfully enshrouding their activities, allowing them to safely rely upon plausible deniability, has been the name of the game since the beginning. To do this, union busters will rely upon a dual set of principles, a false set and a true set. Let's begin with the false principles, such as accountability, respect, transparency, confidentiality, and anything really. On paper, the purported end of these false principles is to improve management. As we discussed before, union busting, or labor consulting as they like to call themselves, attempts to nuzzle themselves safely within the perception that workers ought to receive an equal shake on what both sides have to say about the union matter. The prevailing counterpoint against unionization is this: unions rigidify formally fulfilling processes, cast division among a once united enterprise, and usurp the place of individual bargaining, as well as a previously meritocratic environment, for the right to negotiate. There is also a great emphasis placed upon the notion of change, especially among management labor consultants who position themselves as the olive branch capable of reaching this change without incurring the negative repercussions of unionization. This, combined with the false principles, presents a well-constructed front, bolstered by the strategies that we will soon discuss. However, it's worth noting that union busters play loose and fast with the invocation of these principles. In reality, they are used in service to a set of Machiavellian principles. Principles such as deception, which means to lie and twist information in order to alter sentiment in favor of certain ends. Manipulation, which means to control word and action without notice according to those aforementioned ends. And intimidation, which is to stoke fear and anxiety to alter results at odds with the beliefs of the ones doing them. All three of these principles have one end: to control the opinions and actions of those who would otherwise exercise their rights to unionize. These principles don't just crop out of nowhere. They're merely just the broad themes. There's one thing that gives union busters their bite then: the action that channels these broad themes, their strategies. One of the few takeaways of the research that I've done is how vastly elaborate and sophisticated the union busting playbook is. It's truly a testament to the fact that you can be horrendously depraved as long as you stay true to your Machiavellian roots. The problem is that the truly depraved show up in places that matter the most. Hired management gun happens to be one of those places. When a labor consultant reaches their coveted hunting nest, they set out to systematically unravel any chance of a union win. This is done through the principles that I mentioned above, but the knowledge of just the principles by themselves won't suffice. We need a comprehensive understanding of their strategies. There are about 32 of them and counting. Some of them have been shed over the years in lieu of better ones. Others have had to be shelved due to the slow cogs of justice finally getting around to doing something about them. That being said, a union buster would have to be an absolute moron to forsake these strategies without good reason, because theoretically and logically, they seem to make sense. As you'll soon see, each and every one of these strategies capitalizes on the most unruly elements within us all. If followed loyally and kept a solemn secret, a union buster can go a long way with them. Without further ado, here they are in no particular order. The first strategy is to turn the supervisors. Union busters really focus on one thing, more so than others: the supervisors. They make the whole counter-organizing drive happen. Without them, the attempt would be pathetic. Marty and his colleagues would, 1. Manipulate the management, turning the sentiment and activity of the supervisors towards undermining the organizing effort. Primarily, they would use seminars, rallies, trainings, individual meetings, and personal encounters as the medium to indoctrinate them. Then they would make them swallow their guilt. Typically, the conventional trap to lure these supervisors was the common tactic of guilt tripping and outrage farming, specifically by making supervisors think the push to organize was an indictment and direct threat towards their leadership. In addition, they would rely upon fear and stress more than anything. Crafting loyal soldiers/super soldiers to wage war on their behalf was really the name of the game. Oftentimes, the private opinions of the rank-and-file employees were used to further lubricate this process. A good rule of thumb was to supply a comprehensive set of methodology. All the methodology was to be supplied to them, and they were to be kept loyal to the union busters' doctrines. Use of management meetings was a must as the venue to deliver this training. Reinforcement through bi-weekly meetings is an absolute necessity too, in order to keep the sentiments pitted against the target, the union. Then the busters would let the individual meetings just do the rest. The best strategy for deepening discord would be really through the individual meetings and encounters. These were meant to imbue a sense of closeness between the union buster and key supervisors, to strengthen loyalty, grow their distrust, and extract information whenever they see fit, liberally using it despite stating otherwise. Training really takes on a new hue during the later parts of the gig, when union busters evolve their relationships by developing pupils and deepening training. When it comes to developing pupils, you have to focus on the promising ones. Marty specifically did this in one or more notable drives when he turned the Human Resources and Social Security liaison into a lieutenant to run the supervisors in his stead, and finally when he departed. While all of this is occurring in the background, union busters run a steady and sophisticated training program for both the supervisors and rank and file, separating and combining them whenever they see fit and inundating them with as much propaganda as possible. There's actually a saying among union leaders: for every 2 hours we get, they get 8. During these 8, they spend it by training the rebel out of them. One of the more notable strategies is teaching supervisors on how to work around labor law. For supervisors, rebellious behavior was only permitted if it was in defiance to the labor law and in favor of the employer. This was a tricky little dance though, and much time is spent teaching supervisors the steps. More on this during strategy number 8. Pretty much all of these teachings were to develop a perception that stifles rebellion. The whole game was to develop a perception among workers and supervisors that they were being heard, while actually being hammered. The second overarching strategy is to dig up dirt. Any details on the lives of the employees, good or bad, is invaluable to union busters. To do so, they would look to scrounge up all the personal information of employees, pry through personal files, credit histories, medical records, and family lives, utilize one-on-one meetings. And as we discussed before with one-on-one meetings, it was a perfect venue to extract information on the participant and others. Thirdly, they would disarm through false security. Lying about confidentiality is key for a union buster, and breaking it is even more important. Finally, they would keep a comprehensive record of this information. Some union busters, such as the ones that Marty would link up with as a crew, even drafted diagrams showcasing and standardizing the dirt. One of the more noteworthy strategies is to slander the opposition. An important piece of the union busting approach was to essentially wreck the reputation of the union. To accomplish this, they would typically craft a false narrative of the union and their advocates, lie in lieu of dirt, which was relied upon a lot for some easy scores, spread nasty facts about the union as well, manipulating and deceiving the skeptical by using examples such as,
unions are power-hungry interlopers, both cunning and sluggish or even inefficient. Unions are businesses needing money to survive, money in the forms of dues from its members. Unions are like mother-in-laws, getting in the way of relationships between supervisors and workers. Union stewards are the laziest workers with the biggest mouths. They are everybody's worst nightmare, supervisors especially. Union bosses are going to run their wallets empty. Union dues, fees, fines, policies, rules, assessments, and disciplinary techniques will destroy the peace of the workplace, all the while the union will remain incapable of securing anything for the worker.
Labor consultants would seek to spread these facts relentlessly. They were to be passed out like artillery barrages, meant to corrupt the general vibe of the union. In addition, downplaying the victories of the union was key. It didn't matter if it was a major or minor victory. What was won by the union had to be contorted into something negative. Here's a quotation from the book just to drive home the point. The union won, strictly speaking, but barely anything, just the right to negotiate where the true battle begins. Not only did the victories have to be questioned, but the very methods of the union had to be dragged through the mud. Union busters would also resort towards being racist, anti-Semitic, and classist. You know, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out, but if you get a bunch of bigots in the room and try and convince them that the union represents everything that they claim to hate, you could probably get a lot of people on your side, especially in the 80s. There's also the ludicrously powerful strategy of blaming national issues on unionization, such as the employment rate, inflation, and economy, Now, in modern times, this isn't really going to work that well, but back in the day, it did. In the off chance the union would win the organizing drive, busters would attempt to turn the fight at the negotiating table against the union. This goes without saying, but they would also use training programs during both phases to do the heavy lifting. The reasoning being that they have to get these facts into the rank and file skulls through a veneer of credibility. Finally, and this will be expanded upon during Strategy 8, busters would twist federal mandates. They would take legal mandates in favor of the union and contort them into indictments of the government and the union. The fourth primary strategy is to stay behind the scenes. The whole operation depended on distance from the eventual train wreck that would take place. Union busters are loyal to the strategy, more so than the others. Typically, success as a whole is dependent upon the ability to stay in the background to keep your hands clean and let the insiders do the dirty work. No one will believe the propaganda from a hired gun. It has to come from the insiders. There's also a need to gather information without getting involved. In addition, ensuring that you have a buffer between you and your supervisor allows you to maintain innocence during collection. Finally, and this will be expanded upon during strategy number 11, you have to bolster this distance through paper, email, Teams, anything really. Strategy number 5 is to make the villainy out to be noble. This goes hand in hand with the previous strategy. Not only do you have to keep your hands clean, but you have to put out proclamations such as, "You are the last line of defense." The outside world must be convinced that you are the final safeguard against the wrong decision. In addition, you must pretend that you are the fixer. As we discussed before, union busters on paper purport themselves to be fixers of poor leadership or management who make leaders out of formerly poor supervisors. Upper management must be recast as benevolent by rehabilitating or leading into an image of generosity and familiarity. Doublespeak has to be utilized if you want to win. Pretend that you are another egalitarian element willing to listen and help. Number 7 is ruling through fear. It kind of goes without saying, but fear is a crucial element in the puzzle, especially being talented at employing strategies that instill fear among supervisors by passing the blame onto them, convincing supervisors that their job depends on busting the union, and passing really the whole responsibility onto the supervisors. While this is going on, you have to turn the stress against the union. Make it abundantly clear that this is the union's fault, and watch the attention turn away from you. A union buster also seeks to demoralize both the opposition and the targets. Anyone who wishes to try anything funny, doesn't matter whether they are within the company or an employee dozens of miles away with a budding unionization interest, use your work to nip any pro-union sentiment in the bud. All reliable for union busters is threatening layoffs and plant closures due to potential issues with the company's ability to operate as a going concern, which means pretty much their ability to stay open. Finally, union busters seek to stoke fears about work relationships by convincing the employees that there will be no more room for flexibility among supervisors and rank and file. Everything will be mired in red tape and become rigid or impersonal. I wanted to touch briefly upon a strategy noted above, fluffing the reputation of upper management. This strategy belongs in its own separate category because a rather large part of union busting is taking the battered image of the capital holders of the company and reforging it through manipulation. This is typically done through recasting upper management as benevolent, rehabilitating or leaning into an image of generosity and familiarity. It's typically accomplished through dear fellow employee letters and sometimes involves no-vote parties. Strategy number 8 is to twist the law to your advantage. The NLRA and its sister laws were first proposed as a safeguard for employee and employer rights. We briefly touched upon how many of the laws that followed the NLRA contained parts of them that were completely beholden to management interests. However, these laws typically served as guides for union busters to use. Every labor law has seeds of opportunity that busters could use for their advantage. The NLRA especially, and its amendments, serve as a potent framework for union busting activity. By teaching the supervisors the rules to abide by and how to work around them, union busters optimize the anti-organizing approach. The rules and workarounds can be combined into the following examples. No threatening, but you can issue veiled threats. No interrogating, but you can ask pressing questions. No spying, but you can send the loyal rank and file to do it for you. No making promises. For this one specifically, there's not many workarounds for it. It's particularly tricky to undermine because the union can make promises, but management can't in this regard. However, a union buster or you can turn this one on the union by making it seem like they will break all of them. We also mentioned this during Strategy 3, but you can twist federal mandates. By taking federal mandates in favor of the union and twisting them into indictments of the government and union, you can turn the tables in your favor. In addition to workarounds for these laws, you can actually slither in and out of the loopholes of labor law. Always keep them in the back of your mind if you want to get ahead in the anti-organizing campaign. Finally, a union buster can challenge the authority of the NLRB. This strategy has fallen out of practice over the past few decades due to the court decisions regarding nonprofits, but you can still undermine their authority in other ways. Among the more formal strategies is strategy number 9, the contestment of the bargaining unit. Essentially, union busters and unions both fight for the ideal voting pool in order to promote their specific ends. This is done by redefining the bargaining unit to include more or less votes, primarily to dilute or remove the number of eligible pro-union votes. Strategy number 9 is also meant to encourage discord among the rank and file by highlighting the union's dissent, especially towards proposed increases of unsympathetic voters. You can sow the seeds of discord. An example of this in the primary source is when Marty wanted to remove vocational nurses from the bargaining unit in one drive and include far-flung employees from subsidiaries in another. Strategy number 10, delaying the process, really goes without saying. It's one of the more classic morale drainers. Throughout the initial organizing drive and especially into the post-election negotiation phase, it serves as one of the more reliable strategies. Labor consultants essentially need to delay certain processes, especially ones that involve moving organizing along, drag negotiations through absurd requests and piecemeal cooperation. For this specific one, it's a good idea to ask high-up union officials to attend the meetings. It's also important to send both union members and employees far and wide. Choose an inopportune time and area for any contact with the union or for pro-union employees. Union busters also attempt to deny any proposal that the union tries to make. Especially during the negotiating phase, they give them nothing. And then finally, busters attempt to run out the clock by wasting the 12-month time period allotted for negotiating. It's prudent for a buster to rule through paper and email. This is partially in service to Strategy 4. It's essentially the best method to manipulate and keep track of progress outside of face-to-face contact, allowing union busters to maintain momentum by using supervisors and managers to inundate the rank and file with emails, letters, memos, anything digital really. Draft a list of all employees. This is typically the first order of business for a labor consultant. Supply dear fellow employee emails/letters as a means for rehabilitating the image of management. We talked about this in a strategy above. Email out anti-union facts. Again, we discussed this in Strategy 3. And finally, create a procedure book. This is to be used as a gospel to stifle freedom when desperate. Piggybacking off of the previously mentioned strategy is strategy number 12, tracking all activity. A comprehensive record on activity is necessary for a labor consultant to thwart union activity. This typically is executed through strategies that keep tabs and track employee sentiments. For the purpose of info gathering, labor consultants need to know which nerve to pinch, which link is weak, and where an opportunity might lie. Oftentimes, the good cop, bad cop routine is used to get this information out of employees. Many times they draft a list of potential troublemakers, and they keep an eye on this list and try and update it as much as possible, especially when the organizing drive progresses. It's also important for you to develop a system with symbols to track the status of workers and supervisors. This was used in the more advanced drives, where more busters were working on the same job together. When these systems were drafted, symbols were used to signify loyalty to the anti-organizing drive. One of the strategies that was actually mentioned before is keeping a record of personal information on each employee. In addition to symbols, a comprehensive listing of each worker's personal history, such as hire, pay, marriage, status, etc., was kept. Labor consultants also try to keep a lid on the use of supervisors. Having an eye on the unpromising ones is essential. You can never know when a spurned supervisor will turn. One of the more simpler strategies is strategy number 13, trimming the fat. This one's self-explanatory. You pretty much have to get rid of any unsympathetic employees. When the opportunity presents itself, find ways to cull the pro-union employees. Typically, you have to target them with endless harassment too, and utilize elaborate schemes to remove key union sympathizers. Another short strategy is strategy number 14, repurposing resources. The anti-organizing drive requires the careful siphoning of resources away from the company's mission. This can be accomplished through the redirection of cash flows, imperiling the company's solvency in the process, requesting and utilizing secretaries, upper management, and key supervisors, You pretty much gotta waste resources for the production of emails, letters, running trainings, interference, spying, research, and much more. Strategy number 15 is inconveniencing the union. This is the sister strategy of delaying. The purpose of the strategy is meant to wear down the union's capabilities. This can be typically done by contesting grievances in already established shops, removing strikers from union property, and omitting information through proposals and the Excelsior list. Probably one of the better known strategies is establishing a saturation campaign. Nothing is more important than casting an illuminating presence. Making an effort to drown out all parts of the company and anti-union products and memorabilia helps stifle the organizing drive. By utilizing strategies such as producing anti-union merch and propaganda, such as t-shirts, posters, billboards, stickers, buttons, and much more, throwing anti-organizing parties, which is meant to heighten the appeal of the anti-organizing drive, and make the union look dreary in comparison. Strategy number 17 is manipulate the Excelsior list. The Excelsior list is a document containing the names, addresses, and positions of relevant employees. During the organizing drive, companies are required to provide the list to the union so that the union can reach out to and adequately communicate with its voters. This list can be manipulated, however, through shortening names, addresses, and other details, and just completely omitting details you can get away with removing. Providing ease of access for sympathizers, or strategy number 18, is one of the more obvious strategies. To make it as easy as possible for them to vote and root out union sentiment, labor consultants have to drive them to the polls and inform them of anything they need to know in order to vote. Resorting to gimmicks, or strategy number 19, is one of the weirder strategies. It's a fun one though for union busters, and one that works really well. As you'll soon see, many of Marty's campaigns relied upon last-minute Hail Marys. These can range from placing wagers on the outcome of the election, incentivizing betting. This was for a couple of reasons. First, it was used to gauge where workers are at. In addition, the bets really only involved over and unders for the number of no votes. Now, the bets were more of a staple in the Union Buster book, but the specific ones are going to really blow your socks off. Let's get into them. The ET ploy is an interesting one to start off with. In one of the later campaigns, Marty made one of the more loathed managers dressed up as ET to humiliate himself and instill some kind of levity with the workers, lightening their perception of the company. Another one is the streak debacle. Marty once enlisted the help of one of the more beloved maintenance supervisors of World Airways. He used the idea of him streaking naked if the union lost to manipulate secretaries to vote no. Finally, there's a shopping cart strategy. In the same campaign referenced before, Marty once used company resources to buy the exact amount of goods that equaled yearly union dues. The sympathetic rank and file then piled them high in a shopping cart to illustrate how much they could buy with those dues. Strategy number 20, which I think we probably should have started off with to begin with, is catching the organizing before it begins. Union busters are oftentimes hired to thwart union sentiments before the organizing drive is even mentioned, or filed with the NLRB. The legwork is primarily done through cycling employee attitude surveys. The result of these surveys are anonymous, but sometimes can be traced to a certain employee or department. Attitude surveys can be incredibly effective because they roughly highlight the budding sentiment behind organizing campaigns, i.e. discontent, anxiety, and resentment. However, they fall short in pinpointing where the sentiment comes from. Strategy number 21 is to control the flow of information and disinformation. It's not only important to contribute to the flow of information within the company by using strategy 11 and 12, but actually buckling down and controlling what information gets discussed, whether correct or incorrect, is of utmost importance. A crucial tool in the fight to accomplish this is being able to utilize the question box. The question box, or email account, lets you plant questions and prepare and control real ones, all while presenting itself as a transparent and forthcoming move by the union busters. One of the weirder strategies is actually enlisting the consumer. Sometimes a union buster will conspire to bring consumer loyalty to a fever pitch, creating the extremely rare yet devastating anti-boycott. Typically, these strategies only work in environments where the consumer has extended prolonged time with the company in question, such as for-profit care facilities, hospitals, gyms, etc. Union busters can draw upon the anti-boycott by utilizing one-on-one time spent with the consumer and sympathetic union employees, slyly whispering anti-union sentiment, making use of the press and social media, and finally, spreading the sentiment via word of mouth, which is done by poisoning the minds of the community leaders. Strategy number 23 is to crank up the heat. In the unlikely event that the union wins, union busters have to resort to being heavy-handed with their tactics and strategies during the negotiation phase. This can be accomplished by prohibiting casual interaction, where any talk during a break was to be ceased, cutting off personal relationships, stretching all previously applicable strategies to their absolute limits, targeting union sympathizers by hatching elaborate schemes to do so, and finally, we mentioned this before during strategy number 11, creating a procedure book, which is to be used as gospel to stifle freedom when desperate. A truly potent strategy is to institute a wage and promotion freeze. Perceived stagnation is one of the best ways to manipulate dissent among the employees. Through instituting a partial wage and promotion freeze, only granting them when it suits the anti-union drive, a union buster can invite the perception that stagnation is the business of unions. Some of the particular strategies to pull this off are keeping the freeze a secret, only discussing it with the executives. When it does get out, busters try to make it seem based on merit by reinforcing the idea of the merit shop. Finally, they divvy out the promotions and raises to specific, corruptible, and loyal employees, especially key union supporters who will turn on a dime. Strategy number 25 is to develop a contingency plan for strikes. When a strike is on the horizon, union busters must take the union's most effective tool, the strike, and turn it into a treasure trove of anti-union momentum. This can be done through breeding insecurity, which is accomplished by convincing workers that their jobs will be easily filled if they walk off, intimidating by bringing in security, and keeping the strikers off the property. Finally, the union buster has to figure out how to sneak in the anti-union sympathizers. Obviously, the company needs to use them in order to pick up the slack for the striking workers. So the buster has to figure out how to get them past the picket line. Throughout the entire campaign, union busters must rely upon strategy number 26, transferring the difficult ones out. When the client in question owns subsidiaries or other locations outside of the one that is holding the organizing drive, it's important beyond measure for a union buster to scatter as many union supporters as they can to far-flung places. This is typically executed through strategies that dangle promotions and cushier offers to key employees to remove them from the voting unit and union deck. In Marty's particular case, he tried to transfer multiple employees to a subsidiary of his client to get them out of his hair. After the union morale from the organizing win has been whittled away, the nail in the coffin is brought out into the open. The desertification campaign is the final big gamble, which labor consultants can pass successfully by handpicking the committee that circulates it, ensuring that they are all anti-union to the core, and slow dripping the desertification campaign, then unleashing the floodgates when the morale has been lowered adequately. Strategy number 28 is to divide and conquer by color. We touched upon capitalizing on class issues before, however, this deserves its own place as a major strategy, especially during the later parts of both phases. White collar, blue collar, and pink collar workers have to be pitted against each other, especially by using multiple strategies such as emphasizing the difference between the collars. Doesn't matter how arbitrary they are, a union buster seeks to make the difference a source of pride and division. And finally, rubbing salt in the wound. When a portion of the workforce feels spurned by other parts, labor consultants will hone in on that sentiment and try to deepen it. Probably the most dubious strategy out of all of them is strategy number 29, getting the kids involved. Nothing disarms a group of angry adults more than a starry-eyed kid. When the opportunity arises, union busters make sure to use these impressionable suckers to push the propaganda and soften the resolve of their pro-union adversaries. There's really only one scenario where this can work effectively, and it has to be done through starting an anti-organizing children's contest, such as a poster or painting contest, and then displaying the winner. Finally, you have to capitalize on their naivety. And this could only be done through the parents, the anti-union sympathizers. Now, the strategy was never used that much to begin with, but it's something that might happen in modern times in some capacity. So make sure you watch out for it going forward. Strategy number 30 is to dominate contact with the NLRB. To really drive home the point that the company is in control, a union buster will make use of any sly psychological trick that has a deep effect on the rank and file's perception on how things are going. Especially useful is the ability to monopolize all contact with the NLRB, making the union look like second fiddle to the company. Consultants will do this by driving them to remote polling locations or just polling locations in general. They'll also telegraph their cooperation with simple requests ordered by the NLRB. The second to last strategy, and one of the most important ones to recognize, is to weaponize benefits. The benefit rug pull is really the deal breaker strategy for a lot of pro-union sympathizers. By taking away all benefits and investing them where they see fit, labor consultants reinforce the conception that former perks will be history with the union around. The first thing to go are the breaks. Those 15-minute breaks that are typically vested by management due to good behavior on behalf of the employees are taken away at the snap of a finger. In addition, company perks that aren't highlighted within each employee's contract are taken away too. While this is going on, union busters will dangle these benefits in front of employees in order to make them cease their pro-union sentiments. The final strategy is to placate them by establishing union alternatives. As we talked about before, union alternatives pretend to be a suitable stand-in for unions, while actually serving as a surveilling mechanism. The real catch is that these alternatives have next to no authority, outside of marginal tweaks. The employee roundtable is one of the most popular forms of the union alternative. However, its use in modern times has not really been accounted for. So now that we've wrapped up all the strategies, I just want to let you take a moment to soak in what was just presented. After pretending to be in their shoes for a moment, how did it make you feel? We've all heard the whispers over the years or assumed something was going on. But until now, the idea of union busting has probably remained in your head as a fuzzy gray image. At this point, it's probably wise of us to ask ourselves, what now? Seriously, if the 30-year-old book is giving us some insight into some elaborate shenanigans, even for turbo internet standards, what on earth can labor do to overcome an industry that has probably sharpened their game since the writing of Confessions of a Union Buster? Fortunately for us, many institutions, YouTube channels, blogs, nonprofits, and unions have cropped up over the years. The labor movement also seems to be gathering some momentum with the Amazon, Starbucks, writers, and actors strikes. What I want to do in the next video of my labor series is answer the question by updating our limited and probably outdated conception of union busting strategies and checking the pulse of the modern union movement. Then I want to give my 2 cents on what we can do to help people exercise their right to earn a fair wage. Until then, I'll leave you with this information. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe, comment, and help. Even download the PDF of the strategies and script for your political development. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you in my next video.